British Empire and the Commonwealth of Nations.
But today, we give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital city, war battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed, Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome. In the Far East, we have yet to deal with the Japanese, a determined and cruel foe. The Queen and I know of the ordeals which you have endured throughout the Commonwealth and Empire. We are proud to have shared some of them with you. And we know also that we shall all face the future together. In the hour of danger, we humbly committed our cause into the hand of God. And he has been our strength and shield. Let us thank him for his mercies, and in this hour of victory, commit ourselves and our new task to the guidance of the same strong hand.
Triumph hid the truth. The world was changing, and Britain no longer the country and empire of 1939. George and Elizabeth were to be the last King Emperor and Queen Empress. The jewel in the imperial crown, India, was to become independent in 1947, ripping the heart out of the British Empire. With India gone, the rest would soon follow. George regretted the loss of his imperial title. He also dreaded losing something more precious, his eldest daughter. Elizabeth first met the man who would become her husband, Prince Philip of Greece, in 1939. She was just 13. Princess Elizabeth had fallen in love once and forever. Writing to Philip throughout the war, making her feel grown up to have a boy in uniform to worry about. The king has been called an overprotective father. His relationship with Elizabeth and Margaret falls into a pattern. Children who lack secure and loving relationships with their parents develop over-possessive relationships with their own children. But many men will know the king simply found it hard to believe his daughter could fall so conclusively in love with the first man she really met. Both king and queen wanted Elizabeth to make a happy marriage, but the choices were limited. The king believed his daughter must marry a man of royal rank. By law, Elizabeth could not marry a Catholic. Most available Protestant princes were Germans. In the end, the simple fact that his daughter was crazily in love with Philip made up the king's mind. Philip proposed in 1946, but the king forbade making the engagement public until a year later, wanting his family to be together one last time on a tour of South Africa in 1947. Those thinking the British royal family is not a political force have too simple an idea. The South African trip, taken on battleship HMS Vanguard, was very political. South Africa was a divided, self-governing dominion of the British Empire. White South Africans of Dutch descent, Afrikaners, hated the British connection after the Boer Wars at the start of the 20th century, forcing them into the British Empire. White South Africans of British ancestry saw themselves as part of British civilization. The British ruled with paternal racism, believing they were looking after what were thought the simple native peoples, but still acknowledged basic human rights. The empire aimed to bring non-white people to some national adulthood. Afrikaners saw a different world, believing themselves chosen by God to rule, and saw black Africans as subhuman. The king's visit was lending support to the existing government of Jan Smuts, who, though an Afrikaner, led an alliance between British and Dutch communities. A new hard-line Afrikaner movement, the National Party, was threatening to bring a new order. The trip was also intended to give the king a holiday. The war had drained him of his strength, but it was to be no easy break in the sun. The royal family fell into a furious cauldron of politics. They were ruthlessly criticized by a hostile Afrikaner press. The king was openly mocked when speaking the Dutch Afrikaans language in a gesture of reconciliation. The king became angry when he realized that security was not there to protect him, but to stop him from mixing with his black subjects. He bluntly called the South African authorities the Gestapo. The visit failed. The National Party came to power, creating the legal racism of apartheid, and in time breaking with the empire, rejecting the king and declaring a republic. The royal family returned to London in the spring of 1947, and the princess's engagement was announced. The king gave away his daughter the same year, on the 20th of November, at Westminster Abbey. In the years that followed, the king became increasingly unwell. Winston Churchill was to say of these times that the king walked with death. Throughout the war, the burnt-out king hardly slept and chain-smoked. A string of smoking-related illnesses struck at the king. The Queen, her daughters and Philip increasingly appeared without and in place of the king, who saved his strength for events that demanded the sovereign's presence. At the annual trooping of the colour ceremony, the king abandoned riding on horseback and rode in a carriage. In 1951, the truth of the king's condition could not be hidden, as he returned early from a Scottish holiday for treatment. Just 56 years old, he had the appearance of a man 20 years older. Anxious crowds gathered outside the palace where news bulletins were posted. Ex-King Edward returned to London. The military bands that marched outside the palace muffled their instruments. The treatment was officially called a lung resection. The king had lung cancer, and one lung was removed. But the tumor had spread. The king would die. This news was not told to the British people, and the nation shared in the Queen's self-delusion that the king would make a full recovery.
I'm very grateful indeed for your welcome and for your kind reference to the king. I'm glad to say that he continues to make most excellent progress.
It was Queen Elizabeth's strength that she was always cheerful and optimistic. It came at a price. She was called an emotional ostrich. Those that know her have said what she doesn't want to see, she doesn't look at. People that needed her couldn't always get her help. When Princess Elizabeth and Philip took the place of the King and Queen on a tour of Canada in 1951, they travelled with black mourning clothes and the papers needed for her to be declared Queen. It is possible to see the seriousness on this trip that made George VI's daughter a target of criticism for not smiling enough. But this young woman knows her father is dying. The king was ill again over the Christmas of 1951. In the new year of 1952, the king was to tour East Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Elizabeth and Philip went in his stead. On the 31st of January 1952, they flew to Kenya. Those who knew the king said they had never seen the king so distressed at their parting. As he saw Elizabeth turn on the steps of the plane, it was the last time he would ever lay eyes on his beloved daughter. And it was the last time George VI was seen in public. The king died 6 days later while asleep of a thrombosis. The British people had not been told of his illness. The news was devastating. The king died too young, before his time, adored by his two great passions in life, his family and the British people. As George lay in state, the queues of those wishing to just walk past his coffin were stupefying to the imagination. Ex-King Edward attended the funeral, hoping for reconciliation and a return to the family fold. But the Windsor women closed ranks, and he was not even invited to eat with them. Edward spoke with his mother, Queen Mary, and his brother's widow, now titled Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. He wrote to Wallace that while there was sugar on the surface, there was granite underneath. George VI's wife would never forgive Edward and Wallace for destroying her family life, both forcing her husband onto the throne and into an early grave. The model of royalty, the leadership that George and Elizabeth gave the British people, took Britain through the darkest times of history. In George and Elizabeth, for a short time, the public image of the monarchy met reality and created a royal family that was what Britain wanted and Britain needed. Elizabeth lived on for more than half a century. On her death, people talked of the end of an era, of things never being the same again, of Britain changing forever. The strength and success of what George and Elizabeth built was at the same time a burden to those that followed, a load made heavier by changing times. The model they created, and that was followed by their daughter, was too perfect. It belonged to a time where deference and respect were automatic, and the media kept their distance. Without deference and distance, it failed. How George and Elizabeth in old age would have met the challenges of the 1960s and 70s and those of the 1980s, when the model of royal family life disintegrated into chaos, is pure speculation. Yet the truth remains that George and Elizabeth were in the right place, at the right time, for the British people. George VI could have passed into history a forgotten king, whose reign and life passed quietly by in an unremarkable succession of uneventful years. Fate did not allow him that life. Instead, he is an unforgettable and quite remarkable figure in British history. George VI and his queen were a good king and queen, a great king and queen, and above all, the right king and queen for their time.